March 6, 1944, 26,400 feet above the outskirts of Berlin. The temperature outside the cockpit glass reads minus 41 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze a man's breath to the inside of his oxygen mask in under 90 seconds. Below, the city burns in slow, deliberate columns of black smoke, the work of over 700 American heavy bombers that have just unloaded their weight of judgment on the German capital for the first time in daylight. Hauptmann Dietrich Voss watches the radar returns from his ground station outside Brandenburg, and he allows himself something close to a smile. The bombers are alone. They always have been. No fighter built by the Americans has the legs to follow them this deep into the Reich, and every Luftwaffe pilot vectored into that sky today has been told exactly that, in exactly those words. The image the world remembers is the Mustang diving out of a high sun, wings glinting, engine roaring like a blacksmith's forge given wings. That is the poster. That is the postcard. What the poster does not show is the small brass plate bolted to the cowling of every one of these aircraft, stamped with a name that has nothing to do with Detroit or Dallas or the state of Texas. It reads Rolls-Royce. It is British, and it is the reason 400 P-51s are, at this exact moment, converging on Berlin from 4 different directions, carrying fuel enough to escort the bombers to the target, fight there, and fly home again. Voss does not know this yet. He believes, as his superiors have told him, that no American fighter can reach this far. He is about to learn, in the space of the next 90 seconds, exactly how wrong an entire Air Force can be. In the cockpit of a Mustang nicknamed Kansas Comet, 22-year-old First Lieutenant Walter Hutchins reaches into the breast pocket of his flight jacket and feels the cold, sharp edge of a torn brass plate he has carried since his 3rd mission, when a ground crewman pressed it into his hand and told him, simply, "Keep this close, son. This is what's keeping you alive up here." Hutchins does not know the full story of that plate yet. He knows only that it once belonged to an engine that failed a test flight and was scrapped for parts, and that some superstition among the mechanics said a piece of a good engine, carried by a good pilot, kept both alive. He grips it now, through the leather and the wool, as 4 German fighters bank hard out of a cloud bank 3,000 feet above him. What Dietrich Voss and the men under his command are about to discover is not a story about one dogfight over Berlin. It is the story of how a single decision, made an ocean away in a factory that had nothing to do with fighter planes, would end the war in the air before the ground war had even reached its final year. It began with an engine nobody wanted, bolted into an airframe nobody trusted, flying missions nobody believed were possible. The Mustang that Walter Hutchins flew into the skies over Berlin did not begin its life as a symbol of anything. It began as a compromise, born out of desperation in the spring of 1940, when the British Air Purchasing Commission walked into the offices of North American Aviation and asked for something the company had never built before. They did not want an existing design. They wanted a brand new fighter from a blank sheet of drafting paper, delivered in 120 days. North American's engineers, led by a quiet, meticulous designer named Edgar Schmud, took the challenge not as an insult, but as an opportunity, and what emerged from that sprint was an airframe of startling elegance, a low-drag fuselage shaped more like a bullet than a brawler, wrapped around a British specification and an American engine that would prove, within 2 years, to be its single greatest weakness. That engine was the Allison B-1710, a workhorse at low altitude, but a machine that gasped for air above 15,000 feet the way a man drowns in shallow water, thrashing and straining for something that simply is not there. The early Mustang, designated the P-51A, could outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe possessed below 3 miles of altitude, and above that ceiling, it became nearly useless as a fighter, a beautiful shape with a suffocating heart. The Royal Air Force, disappointed by what the aircraft could not do at the altitudes where the war in Europe was actually being fought, relegated many of these early Mustangs to reconnaissance and ground attack, a demotion that would have buried the design entirely had one test pilot, a Rolls-Royce engineer named Ronnie Harker. not taken one up for a single flight in April of 1942, and come down convinced he had just flown the finest airframe in the war, wasted on the wrong engine. Parker's report crossed desks that most test pilot reports never reach. It reached men with the authority to order an experiment few in the American aviation establishment believed would matter: the transplant of a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant driving the Spitfire, into an American airframe built for an entirely different heart. 4 prototype conversions were ordered. The paperwork alone should have taken a year. The engineers on both sides of the Atlantic did it in months, driven by a shared, unspoken understanding that somewhere over Germany, bomber crews were dying at a rate that no amount of patience could justify. Packard Motor Car Company in Detroit secured the license to build the Merlin on American soil, under American labor, at a scale Rolls-Royce's own factories in Derby could never match. And the aircraft that emerged from this marriage of a British heart and an American body was no longer the aircraft the Luftwaffe had already learned to dismiss. Dietrich Voss, in the winter of 1943, still believed what every briefing document in his possession told him. American escorts turned back at the German border every single time, their fuel exhausted before the real fighting even began. He had said as much to the young pilots under his command, standing before a chalkboard map of Western Europe, tapping a line just west of Aachen. Beyond this point, he told them, the bombers fly alone, and alone is how we kill them. It was in the winter of 1943, a perfectly reasonable thing to believe. It was also about to become the most dangerous assumption in the history of German air defense, because 400 miles away, at a factory in California, a new variant was rolling off the line with drop tanks slung beneath its wings and a Merlin engine breathing easily at 30,000 feet, built to prove Hauptmann Voss wrong in the sky above the city he had sworn to defend. The aircraft that rolled off the Inglewood, California assembly line in the autumn of 1943 carried a new designation, P-51B, and a new voice under its cowling, one that no longer gasped above 15,000 feet, but sang, smooth and unbroken, all the way to 35,000. The transformation was not cosmetic. The Merlin's 2-stage supercharger meant the engine actually gained power as the air grew thinner, the opposite of everything the Allison had struggled against. And for the first time, an American fighter could climb into the same rarefied altitude where German interceptors had always assumed they held an unchallenged advantage. Fitted with 2 108-gallon drop tanks slung beneath its wings, this Mustang could now fly further from its home base than any single-engine fighter in the war, a combat radius exceeding 750 miles, a number that meant nothing on paper and everything in the cockpit, because it was the difference between a bomber crew watching their escort peel away over the North Sea and a bomber crew watching that same escort still flying formation above the target itself. Hauptmann Dietrich Voss received the first fragmented combat reports of American fighters engaging over targets deep inside German airspace with something close to professional contempt. He dismissed the initial sightings as navigational errors, isolated aircraft blown off course, or simple misidentification by frightened gunners who had never learned to distinguish a Mustang silhouette from a captured Spitfire pressed into German markings for testing. Standing before his officers in December of 1943, reviewing a report of P-51s engaged over Kiel for 100 miles beyond what British intelligence had told him was physically possible for a single-engine escort, Voss said the words that would follow him for the rest of the war. They cannot be there. The Americans do not have an engine capable of that range at that altitude. Someone has made an error in the reconnaissance photographs. It was not an error. It was Walter Hutchins and the pilots of the 357th Fighter Group, arriving over targets that German air defense doctrine had specifically designated as beyond the reach of enemy fighters, doctrine that had governed fuel allocation, radar coverage, and pilot training for the better part of 2 years. Hutchins had joined a group only weeks earlier, a farm boy from a wheat county in Kansas who had never seen an ocean before he crossed the Atlantic in the belly of a troop transport, and he carried into every briefing a private terror that he understood with total clarity he was forbidden from ever speaking aloud. The brass plate in his jacket pocket had come to him from a crew chief named Szymanski, a man twice his age who had watched 3 previous pilots fail to return an aircraft he had personally serviced, and who now pressed engine parts into the hands of the living the way other men might press a rosary, less out of superstition than out of a desperate, unspoken need to believe that something of his careful work would follow these boys into the fight and bring them home. What Voss could not yet account for, standing in his briefing room insisting the reconnaissance photographs were flawed, was the industrial machinery now turning behind those photographs, a Packard factory floor in Detroit producing Merlin engines at a rate the Rolls-Royce plant in Derby had never approached, a rate that would eventually see over 55,000 Merlin engines built on American soil before the war's end. Each one a small, precise engineering answer to a question the Luftwaffe had not yet realized it was being asked. The doubt that would soon replace his contempt was still weeks away. For now, Dietrich Voss filed the Kiel report as an anomaly, initialed it, and moved on to the next item on his desk, unaware that the anomaly was about to become the rule. By February of 1944, the anomaly Dietrich Voss had dismissed at his desk had become a pattern too consistent to ignore, and the pattern arrived with a name attached to it that would echo through the rest of the war. Operation Argument, what American aircrews would come to call Big Week, sent wave after wave of heavy bombers deep into the industrial heart of Germany, targeting the aircraft factories at Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Leipzig in a sustained campaign designed to break the Luftwaffe's ability to replace what it lost. For the first time, those bomber formations did not thin out and scatter their escorts at the border. They arrived over the target with fighters still flying tight formation on their wings, fighters that should not have had the fuel to be there, fighters that Voss had told his own pilots, in writing, could not physically reach that airspace. The doubt that crept into Voss's reports during those 6 days of February was not panic. It was the particular, gnawing unease of a professional watching his own carefully constructed doctrine collapse under the weight of evidence he could not explain away. In a memorandum dated February 24th, recovered decades later from Luftwaffe archives, Voss wrote to his superior officer with a question rather than a conclusion, asking whether British intelligence had perhaps understated the range specifications of the American fighter, now designated P-51, and requesting clarification on whether German fuel and altitude assumptions required revision. It was the language of a man choosing his words with great care, unwilling yet to admit that everything he had taught his pilots to believe about the limits of American air power had been wrong from the beginning. For Walter Hutchins, Big Week meant 6 consecutive days of missions that blurred together into a single unbroken exercise in exhaustion and controlled fear, 7 hours in an unpressurized cockpit at altitudes where a canteen of water would freeze solid, followed by a debrief, a few hours of restless sleep, and the same cold walk to the same aircraft before dawn. On the 4th day, escorting bombers toward Schweinfurt, Hutchins watched 2 Messerschmitt 109s attempt the tactic the Luftwaffe had relied on for years against unescorted bombers. A high-speed pass through the formation meant to break up the box and pick off stragglers. The tactic assumed no fighter cover capable of intercepting the pass. Hutchins rolled the Kansas Comet into a diving turn that put him behind the 2nd Messerschmitt in under 11 seconds, close enough that he would later tell his debriefing officer he could see the pilot's head turn once before the German fighter dropped its nose and duff of the deck rather than face a Mustang that had no business being at that altitude in the first place. He did not fire. He did not need to. The German pilot's decision to flee rather than fight was, in its own way, a data point as significant as any gun camera footage, evidence that the psychological balance of that airspace had already begun to shift before a single additional shot was fired. Dietrich Voss would later request the combat reports from that engagement personally, cross-referencing pilot testimony against radar tracks with the meticulous discomfort of a man auditing his own failed predictions. What something strange was happening in those skies became clear to him that week was not merely that American fighters had extended their range. It was that German pilots, trained for years to press the attack against anything short of another fighter, had begun, in isolated but growing numbers, to disengage first. An air force does not lose a war in a single battle. It loses a war in the accumulation of moments just like this one, when its pilots begin making decisions rooted not in tactical doctrine, but in a new and unfamiliar fear. And Voss, filing his reports in the cold light of a Berlin February, was watching that accumulation begin without yet understanding what it would cost him. The fear that Dietrich Voss had begun to detect in his pilots' post-mission reports found its full, terrible expression on March 6, 1944, the day the 8th Air Force sent its bombers to Berlin itself for the first time in daylight, and the day German Fighter Command discovered that even the capital's own airspace, the most heavily defended sky in the Reich, no longer belonged to them alone. The mission cost the Americans 69 bombers, a number that on its own reads as catastrophe, and in the strategic arithmetic of a war of attrition, it very nearly was. But buried inside that terrible number was a second statistic that mattered more in the long run than any single day's losses. The Luftwaffe lost 66 fighters attempting to stop those bombers, pilots, and airframes that Germany, unlike the United States, no longer had the industrial capacity or the training pipeline to replace at anything resembling the rate they were being destroyed. This was the arithmetic that Hermann Göring himself could not escape when the after-action reports crossed his desk. Germany was training new pilots in a compressed program that had shrunk, out of sheer necessity, from the roughly 250 flight hours a Luftwaffe cadet received in 1940 to barely 100 hours by early 1944, sending boys into combat against American pilots who had trained far longer and now flew an aircraft engineered specifically to punish inexperience without mercy. Walter Hutchins, flying escort over Berlin that day, would later describe encountering German fighters that seemed to hesitate at the edge of engagement range, a half-second pause that experienced pilots simply did not have, a half-second that was, more often than not, the exact margin between returning to base and becoming a smoking scar on a German field. It was during this stretch of the air war that Hutchins found himself flying wing on a mission with a replacement pilot barely out of flight school, a boy named Curtis Farrow who had arrived at the squadron only 4 days earlier and who froze mid-formation at the first sight of contrails converging from above. Hutchins would later tell the story at reunions decades after the war, with the particular reluctance of a man revisiting a memory he never fully made peace with. He talked Farrow through the break, calling out the bandits' position over the radio in the flat, patient voice Szymanski's crew chiefs used when a pilot's hand started shaking on the yoke, walked him through the turn that put the attacking Messerschmitt in Farrow's own gun sight rather than his own, and watched the boys' tracers finally connect on his third burst. Farrow would fly 19 more missions and come home. It was a single afternoon, one pilot talking another through 11 seconds of controlled panic 30,000 feet over the Reich's capital. But it was also, in miniature, the entire story of what American numbers and training depth were now doing to a German Air Force that had run out of both. The German High Command's own post-war assessment, compiled by Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland, would later state plainly what Voss and men like him were only beginning to grasp in March of 1944. The appearance of the long-range escort fighter over German soil represented, in Galland's own words, the day the Luftwaffe lost the war. It was not a single dogfight, not a single lost bomber formation, but the slow, compounding realization among German pilots that there was no longer any sanctuary, no altitude, and no distance from the coast, where the fight would not eventually find them, flown by men like Hutchins, in a machine built from a British heart and an American frame, arriving exactly where the doctrine said it could not be. By the spring of 1944, the fear that had first crept into Dietrich Voss's reports had matured into something his own pilots no longer bothered to disguise in their post-mission debriefs. German fighter pilots, men trained under a doctrine that had once treated any American aircraft as an inevitable kill, had begun adopting a phrase among themselves that filtered up through intelligence intercepts and capture documents. Der Herrgott Mustang, God's own Mustang, a bitter, half-reverent nickname for a fighter that seemed to appear wherever it was least expected and least welcome. Voss heard the fray for the first time from a young pilot recovering in a field hospital outside Cologne, a boy who had bailed out over the Rhine after being caught from above by an aircraft his own ground radar had failed to detect, and Voss recorded the phrase in his private notes with the flat, clinical language of a man documenting a symptom he still did not fully understand. The symptom had a cause, and the cause was mathematics that Germany had no way to counter. American aircraft production in 1944 would reach a scale that dwarfed anything the Reich's bombed and dispersed factories could match, with North American Aviation alone turning out finished P-51s at a rate that made individual losses, however painful to the men flying them, strategically survivable in a way no German loss could be. For every Mustang that went down over occupied Europe, another rolled off the line in Inglewood or Dallas within days. For every experienced Luftwaffe pilot killed defending the Reich, there was no equivalent replacement, only a boy with 100 hours of flight time and a 9 in 10 chance, by the actuarial tables that historians would later compile, of not surviving his first month of combat. It was against this backdrop that the second great human story of this aircraft's war unfolded, the story of Second Lieutenant Marion Cole, a fighter pilot from Georgia whose combat record read, on paper, as almost unremarkable next to the aces whose names filled the newspapers back home. Cole flew escort missions through the spring of 1944 with a quiet, methodical competence that his squadron mates respected without romanticizing, until the afternoon of May 12th, when his Mustang took a burst of flak over the marshalling yards near Chaumont that tore through his coolant lines and left him trailing white smoke over enemy territory, 60 miles from the nearest stretch of friendly coastline. Every instinct and every piece of training told Cole to bail out immediately rather than risk an engine seizure at altitude, and every account from men who flew with him afterward describes the particular, deliberate calm with which he instead throttled back, nursed the failing engine's temperature down by a matter of degrees, and began a long, shallow glide toward the channel, radioing his position every few minutes in a voice that never once cracked. He made the coastline with the engine seized solid, ditched in the cold water within sight of a British fishing trawler, and was pulled from the channel 40 minutes later, alive, because he had refused to abandon an aircraft that still had, in his own words to the intelligence officer who debriefed him, one more mile left in her. It was precisely this kind of margin, an engine that could be nursed rather than simply failing outright, a design tolerant enough to survive damage that would have doomed a less robust airframe, that the accumulated combat data was now revealing to strategists on both sides of the war. Perhaps the ultimate vindication for this design came when a Luftwaffe technical report captured after the war acknowledged that no comparable German fighter of the period offered its pilots the same margin for error under battle damage, a private admission of the exact quality that had, days earlier, brought Marion Cole home from the middle of the English Channel with nothing left to fly on, but momentum and a stubborn engine that refused to quit before its pilot did. By the summer of 1944, the aircraft that Dietrich Voss had once dismissed as a British-hearted oddity with no business in German airspace had become the single most feared silhouette over occupied Europe. And nowhere was that fear more consequential than in the skies above Normandy on the morning of June 6th. The Mustang's role on D-Day was not the role its designers had originally imagined for it. It had been built to escort bombers to Berlin and back, a long-legged guardian rather than a ground attack weapon, but the invasion demanded something else entirely, and the aircraft adapted to that demand with a versatility that surprised even the men who had spent 2 years learning its limits. Walter Hutchins flew 4 sorties on June 6th alone, none of them the high-altitude bomber escort work that had defined his war so far, all of them low-level sweeps over the beachhead and the roads leading inland, hunting German armor and troop columns racing toward the coast. It was dangerous work in a way that high-altitude combat was not. At treetop height, a single rifle round from an infantryman in a roadside ditch could bring down an aircraft as surely as a burst from an enemy fighter, and Hutchins would later describe the low-level missions over Normandy as the only time in the war he felt genuinely, continuously afraid, not of any single enemy, but of the ground itself, of the sheer density of hostile fire rising from every hedgerow and farmhouse below him. What made the difference that day, in the weeks of fighting across France that followed, was the same design tolerance that had carried Marion Cole across the English Channel on a seized engine. The Mustang's low-slung air intake and rugged undercarriage let pilots bring the aircraft down a treetop height and hold it there through violent, evasive maneuvers that would have torn a more delicate airframe apart. And its self-sealing fuel tanks, a hard-won lesson from the aircraft's earliest combat losses, meant that ground fire, which would have turned an unmodified fighter into a fireball, instead sent pilots home with holes in their wings and a story to tell at the debrief. German intelligence had failed to notice one catastrophic detail in its early assessments of the aircraft, that a fighter designed for high-altitude escort would prove just as lethal and nearly as durable. At 50 feet above a French wheat field, hunting panzer columns that had no fighter cover left to protect them, because that cover had already been bled dry in the skies over Berlin, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg months earlier. Dietrich Voss, reassigned by this point to a defensive fighter wing struggling to protect German positions in France, filed a report in the second week of June that historians would later cite as one of the clearest single documents of Luftwaffe institutional despair. In it, Voss noted that his squadron had received 11 replacement pilots that month, none with more than 90 hours of total flight time, to face an enemy that now seemed to control the sky over every road, every rail junction, and every river crossing in Normandy at will. He requested not additional aircraft, which the factories could no longer reliably supply in any case, but additional time to train the pilots he already had, a request his superiors could not grant because the invasion did not wait for training schedules, and because the mathematics of the war had already tipped decisively against him in ways no single report could reverse. It was in this same period, amid the chaos of the breakout from Normandy, that the third defining human story of this documentary took shape. The story of a young reconnaissance pilot named Elijah Voss Marsh, whose solo missions deep behind German lines in a stripped-down, unarmed variant of the Mustang would carry him into some of the most harrowing hours any American pilot faced that summer. Elijah Voss Marsh had never wanted to be a fighter pilot in the conventional sense, and the aircraft he flew that August reflected that fact in every rivet. His Mustang carried no guns worth mentioning for offensive combat, stripped down instead for photographic reconnaissance, its wing hardpoints given over to extra fuel tanks rather than ordnance, its cockpit crowded with camera controls in place of the gunsight ballistics computer his squadron mates relied on. Marsh's war was a war of solitude, flying deep into territory no formation of bombers would touch, alone at altitudes chosen not for combat advantage, but for the clarity of the photographs his cameras could capture of German troop concentrations, rail movements, and the fortified positions the Allied ground command needed mapped before it committed men to attack them. On August 14th, flying a solo mission to photograph German armor reportedly massing near Falaise, Marsh found himself alone over a pocket of German forces that intelligence had badly underestimated, a concentration of anti-aircraft batteries thick enough that the flak bursts around his aircraft, by his own account recorded in his debrief, seemed at moments to form an unbroken black wall rather than individual explosions. He had no wingman to call for support and no armament to fight his way clear if fighters appeared. Only the aircraft's speed and his own nerve, and he held his photographic run steady through nearly 4 minutes of continuous fire, completing the full sequence of exposures his mission required before diving away at full throttle toward the safety of Allied lines. The photographs Marsh brought back that afternoon would later be credited in the official after-action assessment filed by his reconnaissance wing, with revealing the exact scale and position of the German forces attempting to escape the closing Falaise pocket, intelligence that shaped the artillery and airstrikes that helped seal one of the most decisive Allied victories of the entire Normandy campaign, a battle that would trap and destroy the better part of 2 German armies. Marsh himself received little public recognition for the mission at the time, his name absent from the newspapers that celebrated the fighter aces of the same summer, and it was only decades later when military historians began reconstructing the intelligence chain behind Falaise that his solitary 4 minutes over the flak choke pocket were properly credited as one of the quieter, unglamorous acts of raw nerve that made the more celebrated victories possible at all. Something strange was happening in those skies by this point in the war, something that went beyond any single mission or any single pilot's courage. The aircraft that had begun its life as a compromise, an unwanted British engine married to an unproven American airframe, had become so thoroughly dominant across every conceivable role, escort, ground attack, and now unarmed reconnaissance, that German commanders in the field had begun instructing their own anti-aircraft crews to fire on any single engine fighter matching its silhouette regardless of markings. So certain had they become that any such aircraft in the sky above them belonged to the enemy. Dietrich Voss, monitoring these same ground reports from his increasingly beleaguered fighter wing, would later write in a post-war memoir that by the autumn of 1944, the sight of that distinctive canopy and those clipped wings had stopped registering to German soldiers as a specific threat to be countered and had become instead something closer to weather, an omnipresent condition of the sky itself that no tactical adjustment could change. By the autumn of 1944, the war in air over Germany had entered a phase that Dietrich Voss himself would later describe, in the same post-war memoir, as less a campaign than a slow, methodical dismantling of everything the Luftwaffe had once been. The aircraft that had first troubled him over the skies near Caen in the spring of 1943 was now escorting bomber streams numbering in the hundreds all the way to Berlin and back, a round trip of well over 1,000 miles that would have been unthinkable for any single-engine fighter just 2 years earlier, and doing so not as a novelty or an exception, but as the standing, expected condition of every major raid. It was in this period that Walter Hutchins, now a flight leader with 11 confirmed victories to his name, returned briefly to the same stretch of German airspace, where his war had nearly ended in the spring of 1943, escorting a bomber formation toward the same industrial region near Caen that had first introduced him to combat. The nose art on his aircraft, the small hand-painted eagle his crew chief had added after his first confirmed kill, had by now been repainted twice, each version slightly more elaborate than the last. A running joke among his ground crew about how many more coats of paint the aircraft would need before the war ended. Hutchins would later tell an interviewer that flying back over that same corridor of sky, seeing the same rail junctions and river bends he remembered from his earliest, most frightened missions, gave him a strange, quiet vertigo, a sense of having circled all the way back to where he started, except now the German fighters that had once come screaming down out of the sun in overwhelming numbers simply did not rise to meet him at all. There was nothing left to send. Fuel shortages, pilot shortages, and the accumulated weight of 2 years of exactly this kind of attrition had hollowed out the force that once ruled this same sky, and the silence itself, Hutchins said, was more unsettling than any dogfight had ever been. German fighter production had not stopped, and in fact, in one of the war's stranger ironies, actual aircraft output from underground and dispersed factories continued rising well into 1944 even as Allied bombing intensified. But production of aircraft had become almost meaningless without pilots trained well enough to fly them, and it was here, in the widening gap between airframes and airmen, that the true and irreversible collapse was occurring. Dietrich Voss's own fighter wing had been reduced, by his own account, to barely a third of its authorized strength by October, with replacement pilots arriving with flight hours so minimal that Voss described assigning them to combat missions as an act closer to execution than training. It was against this backdrop of German collapse that the Mustang would face its final and in many ways most symbolically important test of the war, not against a fighter at all, but against a machine that represented Germany's last, desperate gamble to reclaim technological superiority in the air. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, an aircraft nearly 100 miles per hour faster than anything with a propeller could ever hope to match. The Me-262 should, by every conventional measure of aerial combat, have rendered the aircraft that carried Walter Hutchins and men like him obsolete overnight. Its top speed exceeded 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest Mustang variant, and its 430mm cannons could tear a bomber apart with a single accurate burst from a distance the Mustang's own machine guns could never hope to match. German propaganda in the autumn of 1944 promoted the jet as the miracle weapon that would finally reverse the course of the air war. And for the pilots flying it, men who had watched their piston engine comrades die in mounting numbers for 2 years, the aircraft represented something close to salvation. What German engineers had not fully solved, however, was the vulnerability of a revolutionary aircraft during the brief, unavoidable windows when its advantages meant nothing at all: takeoff and landing. The Me-262's jet engines, primitive by later standards, accelerated slowly and left the aircraft crawling at low, vulnerable speeds during exactly the moments it was most exposed, climbing away from its base or descending toward it with fuel running low. American pilots learned quickly to identify German jet airfields and to loiter nearby, patient and predatory, waiting for exactly this window. Walter Hutchins achieved his 12th and final confirmed victory of the war in November 1944 in precisely this manner, diving on a Me-262 as it struggled through its climb out from an airfield near Osnabrück, catching the jet at a speed low enough that his own aircraft's more conventional but honestly earned maneuverability closed the gap before the German pilot could accelerate clear. It was not a fair fight in the sense that classic dogfights of 1943 had been fair fights, and Hutchins himself would later acknowledge as much, but it reflected a deeper truth about the entire air war that this documentary has traced from its opening scene. That raw technological superiority, however impressive on paper, meant little without the trained pilots, the fuel reserves, and above all the surrounding infrastructure of a healthy air force to support it, and Germany, by late 1944, possessed none of these things in sufficient quantity to translate the Me-262's brilliance into a reversal of fortune. Perhaps the ultimate vindication for this design came in the accumulated statistics of these jet encounters across the final months of the war. Despite its overwhelming speed advantage, the Me-262 achieved a far lower kill ratio against American fighters than German commanders had projected, and losses to exactly this kind of takeoff and landing ambush accounted for a significant share of the roughly 100 Me-262s lost in air-to-air combat, a number dwarfed by the more than 15,000 Mustangs that had by now rolled off American production lines. More steel and disciplined patience than any single German miracle weapon could overcome. Dietrich Voss did not fly the Me-262 himself, his own career winding down through 1945 in increasingly desperate defensive sorties against bomber formations he no longer had the strength to seriously oppose. But he would write after the war that the jet's failure to change the war's outcome taught him more about the nature of air power than any single battle had, a lesson that would shape his understanding of the conflict for the rest of his life and bring this documentary's central character, the aircraft that outlasted an empire's last miracle weapon, to the edge of its final, war-ending chapter. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the aircraft that had first appeared over the skies near Caen, France, in the spring of 1943 as an unproven, awkwardly proportioned newcomer had, by the war's final tally, become the single most produced American fighter of the entire conflict, with 15,683 built, flying more sorties, claiming more aerial victories, and escorting more bombers safely home than any other fighter type in the United States Army Air Forces. It had started as a compromise nobody in Washington particularly believed in, and it ended as the aircraft German pilots feared more than any other machine in the sky, a verdict rendered not by American propaganda, but by the German Air Force's own tactical adjustments, its own intelligence reports, and ultimately its own surviving pilots. Dietrich Voss survived the war, one of a shrinking minority of German fighter pilots from the 1943 generation who lived to see 1945, and in a memoir he published decades later, he returned, almost involuntarily, to the same aircraft and the same memory that had opened this documentary. The spring morning near Caen, when he and his squadron mates had first laughed at the awkward silhouette climbing toward them, certain of an easy kill. He wrote that he had spent the rest of the war, and much of his life afterward, trying to understand how an aircraft that had looked so unremarkable in that first encounter had gone on to become the instrument of his Air Force's slow, complete unraveling. His conclusion, offered without bitterness, was that the aircraft itself had never been the true weapon. The true weapon had been the industrial and human system behind it, an economy capable of building 15,000 of them, and pilots trained deeply enough to fly them without hesitation, something Germany, for all its early technical brilliance, had simply run out of the time and resources to match. Walter Hutchins came home in 1945 with 12 confirmed victories and a nose art eagle on the side of his aircraft that had been repainted twice during the war, each version a little more detailed, a little more confident than the last, a small hand-painted record of a young pilot's survival stretched across nearly 2 years of combat. That aircraft, like most of its kind, was sold for scrap in the massive post-war drawdown of American air power. Propellers and airframes melted down by the thousands in fields across England and the Pacific, the fate of a machine that had, for a brief and violent moment, been irreplaceable and was now, in peacetime, simply surplus. But not every trace disappeared. The nose art panel from Hutchins's aircraft, the Eagle repainted twice, was salvaged before scrapping by a maintenance crew who recognized what it represented. And it survives today, faded but unmistakable, in a glass case at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. A few feet from a fully restored Mustang, standing on the same kind of concrete apron this aircraft type once used at forward airfields across England and France. Visitors who stop in front of that panel rarely know Hutchins's name or the exact number of his victories, but the Eagle is still there, its paint still faintly layered where a young pilot's crew chief added one more coat for one more kill, a physical fragment of exactly the same aircraft, the same war, and the same sky this documentary began in, over Caen, France, in the spring of 1943, when a formation of German pilots looked up and laughed at something they did not yet understand they should have feared.